Hello and welcome to 10 Minutes On, the podcast where we look at the stories behind the headlines and try to make sense of what's really going on. My name is Burton, and I'm a researcher and scholar of politics and international relations. Each week, this podcast is less about breaking news and more about stepping back and looking at patterns, power, and change. This week, I want to look at two stories. On the surface, they seem very different. One is about the international system, the other is about domestic politics inside the United States. But they are closely connected. Both have the United States at their heart, and both tell us something important about the kind of change now underway, within America and in the world beyond it. Taken together, these stories point to a deeper theme, what I want to call the end of the liberal illusion, the belief that liberal norms, institutions and restraints would ultimately govern both international politics and domestic democracy. That illusion is now collapsing, abroad and at home. So let me start with the international story. Last week at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a speech that attracted a great deal of attention. For scholars of international relations, much of what he said was not especially new. But what was notable was that it was being said so openly and so bluntly by a senior Western political leader. Carney's core argument was simple and stark. The old world, he said, is gone and is not coming back. For decades, the West sustained what he described as a fiction, that the liberal international order was just, fair, and universally beneficial. In reality, he argued, it never was. What Carney was really describing was the end of the liberal illusion at the international level, the idea that global rules were fair, universal, and ultimately self-reinforcing, even when power politics told a different story. To make that point, Carney reached for an image drawn from Václav Havel. Havel once described a greengrocer in a communist system who places a sign in his shop window reading "Workers of the World Unite." The greengrocer doesn't believe it. No one does. But the system survives because the sign stays in the window. The fiction holds. Carney's message was that the sign has now fallen down, and that pretending otherwise no longer makes sense. He reinforced the point with a second reference, this time to Thucydides, and the famous dictum that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. It was a bleak framing, and deliberately so. Carney argued that middle powers like Canada must stop sustaining the fiction. They need to take the poster out of the window. While he did not name Donald Trump directly, the implication was clear. Failures of global integration in financial, health, energy and geopolitical areas have exposed the limits of the multilateral system. Institutions such as the United Nations, the WTO and even climate negotiations now look increasingly fragile. The closest Carney came to naming the United States explicitly was when he remarked that hegemons cannot indefinitely monetize their relationships, a pointed comment in an era of tariffs, transactional alliances and pressure politics. So what should states like Canada do? Carney's answer was to hedge. This idea has been circulating in international relations theory and practice for more than a decade. It means diversifying relationships, spreading risk, and avoiding overdependence on any single partner. In practice, that translates into what he called variable geometry, building coalitions with different partners on different issues depending on shared interests and values. So that would mean supporting Denmark and Greenland on territorial integrity, backing NATO on security, while also maintaining strategic partnerships with countries such as China or Qatar on trade and energy. Carney summed it up with a memorable line, "If you're not at the table, you're on the menu." Up to a point, I agree with this diagnosis. Middle powers do need to adapt. They do need to diversify. And they do need to accept that the world has changed. But there are also problems with the vision that Carney lays out. The first is normative. Yes, democracy and liberalism often functioned as a fiction in the international order, but they were also ideals, benchmarks that shaped expectations and behavior. The world Carney seems to accept is one in which those values are no longer universal, even in aspiration. That is not a neutral shift. It has consequences. Secondly, there are risks in the kind of pragmatism that he advocates. Choosing who to work with matters. partnering with authoritarian states like China or Qatar may make narrow sense on trade or energy, but it also strengthens those states, and they have their own interests, incentives, and models of governance that they are actively trying to promote. And third, Carney's use of Thucydides risks overstating the brutality of international politics. We do not live in a purely Hobbesian world. Nearly a century ago, thinkers associated with the English School of International Relations argued that while the international system lacks a world government, it is still an international society, structured by norms, rules, and expectations. If power alone ruled, diplomacy would never have developed, nor would international law. So yes, Carney's speech may be overly stark, but it is also valuable because it captures where we are. The key point is this: the world has changed and is not going back. And that matters because the end of the liberal illusion is not just happening internationally, it is unfolding inside the United States itself. For a long time, particularly after Joe Biden replaced Donald Trump in 2021, there was an assumption that Trump's first presidency had been an aberration, a bad dream. Normal service, many thought, had resumed. We now know that assumption was wrong. Trump's re-election, the hollowing out of moderate conservatism within the Republican Party, and its full embrace of MAGA nationalism suggests something else entirely, that Biden, not Trump, was the interregnum. And you can see that change playing out not just in Washington, but on America's streets. And that brings us to Minneapolis. Over the weekend, Alex Pretty, a nurse and an American citizen, was killed by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, agents. This followed the killing earlier in the month of another American citizen, Renee Good. The deaths have triggered protests in Minneapolis and beyond. At one level, that backlash is encouraging. It shows that there is still resistance, that parts of American society reject what is happening. Polls suggest Trump's approval rating now sits at around 40%. But the picture is deeply polarized. Support remains strong among Republican voters. If there is resistance, for now it is coming primarily from the streets. Democratic leadership in Congress has been hesitant and largely ineffective, constrained institutionally, but also lacking urgency. Now, since Trump returned to the White House, ICE has expanded dramatically. Between early 2025 and the end of November, the number of people detained nearly doubled, reaching around 65,000 people. Nearly three-quarters of those detained had no criminal convictions. Deportations rose to around 622,000 in 2025, more than double the typical annual figure. For a time, ICE could operate so long as immigrants were successfully othered. But the pressure to increase numbers has consequences. You cannot run a mass detention and deportation system without eventually ensnaring citizens as well. At least 200 Americans have reportedly been detained, families have been separated, and now citizens have been killed on camera. The administration's response has been to double down, claiming that the victims were not victims at all, but threats to ICE agents. That framing has been reinforced by right-wing media. What matters, though, is how those narratives now travel. More than half of Americans get their news primarily through social media platforms such as Facebook and YouTube. Content from partisan outlets is clipped, shared, and amplified by algorithms that reward outrage and confirmation rather than scrutiny. The result is a feedback loop in which official justifications for violence are normalized, not just on cable television, but across digital spaces where many Americans now form their views. And here again, the liberal illusion does real damage. The belief that more information naturally produces accountability and that institutions will correct excesses on their own. This matters because violence is not incidental to ICE. Fear and coercion are baked into its structure. And more broadly, the Trump administration is not simply enforcing policy, it is imposing an authoritarian vision. Figures like Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and J.D. Vance reject the existing system outright. Trump is their vehicle, a leader with long-standing strongman instincts and a deep hostility to constitutional constraints. Casual discussion of a third term or of delaying elections is not normal, nor should it be treated as such. This brings me to the question many have hesitated to ask directly. Is the United States sliding towards fascism? Before Trump's re-election, critics such as the Harvard scholar Jason Stanley warned that Trumpism displayed fascist traits. replacing institutions with loyalists, targeting minorities, criminalizing political opponents. At the time, many dismissed this as exaggerated. But fascism is not a fixed template. It is a process. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The reluctance to name this process is itself a legacy of the liberal illusion, the belief that it can't happen here, because institutions will intervene before it goes too far. ICE agents now operate beyond meaningful legal constraint, answering to the man in the White House rather than to Congress or the courts. The Justice Department has been weaponized, political opponents have been subpoenaed and indicted. And Trump has shown repeatedly that he will not play by the rules, from election denial in 2020 to the pardoning of those who attacked the Capitol. So yes, America is changing. Yes, there is resistance, but it is fragmented and so far limited. The administration appears to believe it can act with impunity. That is a dangerous calculation. Escalation is possible, and some within the system may even welcome it as a justification for further repression. And that brings us back to the international level. If Trumpism is not a moment, but a movement, then other states, including America's allies, must plan accordingly. Hedging makes sense. Diversification makes sense. But without a clear set of values, what remains are transactional relationships, deals without direction, pragmatism without principle. So whether we are talking about global order or American democracy, the pattern is the same. The liberal illusion is ending. The belief that rules restrain power, that norms enforce themselves, that moderation is the default, that belief no longer holds. What comes next is not yet clear, but pretending that the old order still governs, keeping the posters in the window, is no longer an option. So that's where I'm going to leave it for this week. Thank you for taking the time to listen. If you found this episode useful, please consider leaving us a review, sharing it with others, or subscribing. New episodes come out every Tuesday morning. As ever, I welcome your feedback and suggestions for future topics. And you can reach me via Blue Sky, LinkedIn, or through my website at guyburton.net. Thank you again for listening. I'll be back next week with another episode of 10 Minutes On Tuesday morning. Have a good week, and goodbye.